At 6:44 p.m. Eastern on April 6, 2026, Orion integrity slipped behind the far side of the Moon and Earth went silent. No voice from Houston, no live telemetry, no signal returning through NASA's Deep Space Network. The blackout was planned, but that changed nothing about what it meant. For roughly 40 minutes, the Moon itself became a wall between four astronauts and every human being alive. In Vietnam, that moment began around 5:44 a.m. on April 7th. The clock kept moving. The spacecraft kept flying. But for the people on Earth, Artemis II had vanished. That is what made this moment terrifying. Not failure, not fire, not an explosion in the dark. Terror came from something colder, absolute isolation. Artemis II was already the first crewed lunar flyby since Apollo 17 in 1972. The first time in more than half a century that human beings had returned to the Moon's neighborhood. Launched from Kennedy Space Center on April 1st, the mission carried Reed Wiseman, Victor Glover, Christina Koch, and Jeremy Hansen on a 10-day flight designed to push Orion, its systems, and its crew deep into space and back again. This was not spectacle. It was a test of whether humans could survive the next era of lunar exploration. The mission was built on precision. A free return trajectory meant the spacecraft would loop around the Moon and let gravity help pull it back toward Earth. That elegant path sounds safe when drawn on paper. In reality, it carried the crew farther from Earth than any humans had ever traveled in history. NASA confirmed Artemis II would reach 252,756 miles from home, surpassing the record set by Apollo 13 in 1970. Around the same stretch of flight, Orion would pass just over 4,067 miles above the lunar surface. That is close enough for breathtaking science, but also deep enough for the Moon to erase Earth completely. And that is where the story truly begins. Because once integrity crossed that edge at 6:44 p.m., the mission stopped feeling like a triumphal return and started feeling like an exposure. The crew could still see. They could still work. They could still observe craters, basins, shadows, and the severe geometry of the lunar horizon. But they were now operating in the one place where the oldest human instinct becomes useless, calling home. For 40 minutes, the most advanced crewed spacecraft on Earth was reduced to 4 people, a pressure shell, and the knowledge that if anything went wrong behind that stone horizon, no one on Earth could answer. Before that silence, Artemis II still looked like a triumph in motion. Orion integrity was doing exactly what it had been built to do. This was NASA's first crewed flight of the Artemis program, a 10-day test mission designed to prove that Orion, the space launch system, and the crew themselves could survive a deep space journey around the Moon and back. Reed Wiseman commanded the spacecraft. Victor Glover served as pilot. Christina Koch and Jeremy Hansen worked as mission specialists. Every hour of the flight existed for one reason: to prepare for the next stage, when Artemis missions would stop circling the Moon and start returning people to its surface. Artemis II was not there to land. It was there to prove that human beings could leave Earth again, cross the old Apollo boundary, and trust a new spacecraft with their lives. That is why the lunar flyby mattered so much. On April 6th, NASA's published timeline placed the crew's observation window beginning at 2:45 p.m. Eastern. They would watch the Moon grow from a distant world into a horizon-filling mass. At 6:44 p.m., Mission Control expected loss of signal. At about 7 p.m., Orion would pass roughly 4,067 miles above the lunar surface. At 7:02 p.m., the spacecraft would reach its maximum distance from Earth, about 252,756 miles, setting a new human spaceflight record. Then, at about 7:24 to 7:25 p.m., communications would return as Earth rose again beyond the Moon's edge. None of this was accidental. Every milestone had been forecast. Every second had been rehearsed. And that made the blackout more unnerving, not less, because everyone knew exactly when contact would end. The cause was brutally simple. Orion did not lose contact because of malfunction. It disappeared because the moon itself blocked the path. NASA stated that once the spacecraft moved behind the lunar far side, the surface prevented the deep space network from maintaining radio contact. No direct line of sight meant no voices from Houston, no real-time telemetry flowing home, and no immediate reassurance for the people watching from Earth. Similar blackouts had happened during Apollo and even Artemis I, but history did not make the moment smaller. It made it clearer. For 40 minutes, the most advanced crewed spacecraft on Earth was ruled by one ancient law of the universe. Matter gets in the way, distance does the rest, and silence can be perfectly normal, right before it starts to feel unbearable. What happened inside those 40 minutes is what makes the silence more than a technical detail. Before Orion disappeared, the crew had already been feeding Mission Control a constant stream of observations. NASA's science team had prepared 30 lunar targets for the flyby, including Orion Basin, a nearly 600-mile impact structure straddling the near and far sides, and Hertzsprung Basin, an older, more eroded scar deeper on the far side. As the spacecraft closed in, the astronauts described subtle bands of brown and blue across the surface, differences in brightness, texture, and age that human eyes could catch in real time. Mission Control listened, adjusted the plan, and sent back fresh guidance. Then the moon cut the line. The conversation ended instantly, while the science kept unfolding in silence. At 6:41 p.m. Eastern, just before the blackout fully took hold, the crew watched an Earthset. From Orion's windows, Earth did not explode or fade. It simply dropped below the lunar horizon and vanished behind rock. 3 minutes later, at 6:44, communications went out exactly as predicted. NASA had already said this would happen because all far-side missions relying on Earth-based infrastructure face the same problem: the moon blocks the signal, and there is no direct line through it. Even Orion's advanced optical communications hardware could not change that in this phase of flight. In practical terms, the most valuable thing in human spaceflight, voice telemetry, reassurance correction, was gone. The crew still had procedures. They still had checklists. What they no longer had was immediate help. And that is where the danger becomes psychological as much as physical. Communications are not just convenience in deep space. NASA describes them as the essential link that keeps crew, safety decision-making, images, research, and human connection alive across distance. Strip that link away behind the far side of the moon, and the spacecraft becomes something colder, a sealed habitat moving at thousands of miles per hour through a place where every mistake remains on board with the people who make it. Orion reached closest approach at about 7 p.m., and the crew hit maximum distance from Earth at 7:02 p.m., deeper into isolation than Apollo 13 ever traveled. The timing is almost cruel. Humanity's greatest reach arrived at the exact moment humanity became unreachable. Then the silence ended, and what returned was not comfort, it was perspective. It was, as Orion emerged from behind the moon at about 7:24 to 7:25 p.m., Eastern Earth rose again over the opposite edge of the lunar horizon. During the blackout, the crew had crossed the far side, reached closest approach, and passed the most distant point any human had ever been from home. When contact came back, the spacecraft had not merely survived a communications gap. It had carried 4 people through the one region of the mission where Earth could disappear, and then handed Earth back to them as a blue object in blackness, smaller than instinct says it should be. But the flyby was not done. After the observation period, the alignment of spacecraft moon and sun created a nearly hour-long solar eclipse. NASA said the crew saw the moon fully block the sun and had almost 54 minutes of totality, far longer than the brief total eclipses seen from Earth. The sun's corona burned around the lunar disk like a ring of exposed plasma, while stars appeared in the background because the moon itself was in darkness. This was one of the strangest visual reversals in the entire mission. The astronauts were close to the moon, but the moon was no longer a bright world. It became a black cutout, a silhouette with the sun leaking around it. That darkness revealed something else. During the eclipse, NASA reported that the crew saw 6 brief light flashes on the lunar surface, caused by meteoroids striking at enormous speed. In other words, while humanity was celebrating its return to deep space, the moon kept demonstrating what deep space actually is: an open environment where debris arrives without warning, and rock offers no mercy. Science teams wanted those observations because they reveal the dynamic lunar environment. But inside the story of Artemis II, they did something more unsettling. They turned the surface below from scenery into evidence. The moon was not waiting for humans. It was being hit in real time. And that is why the emotional tone of the mission changed after the blackout. The crew did not come back describing simple beauty. They described being moved, overwhelmed, struck by the terrain, the colors, the blackness around Earth, and the almost unreal geometry of what they had just seen. Victor Glover even said he offered a brief prayer during the 40-minute loss of signal before continuing his scientific observations. That detail matters because it captures the true shape of the moment. Artemis II was still a test flight, still controlled, still successful. But once Earth had set, once the radios had gone quiet, once the flashes appeared on the moon and the sun turned into a halo, the mission stopped looking like exploration and started looking like exposure. By the time the moon was behind them, Artemis II had already changed the meaning of distance. NASA confirmed that the crew did not just complete a successful lunar flyby. They broke the long-standing human spaceflight distance record, photographed terrain on the far side, observed Earthset and Earthrise, studied the sun's corona during a rare in-space eclipse, and reported 6 meteoroid flashes striking the darkened moon below. In pure mission language, that is science imaging, navigation, and systems validation. In human language, it is something harsher. It means 4 people went farther from home than anyone in history, and used that distance to prove that the next era of exploration will not be built on romance alone, but on endurance, discipline, and the ability to function while cut off from the world that made them. And the mission did not end at the moment contact returned. On Flight Day 7, Orion executed its first return correction burn, a small but critical engine firing that nudged the spacecraft onto its path back to Earth. NASA also confirmed that recovery operations were already moving into place, with the USS John P. Murtha heading toward the Pacific Recovery Zone. As of April 8th, the crew was more than halfway through the mission, transitioning from the emotional violence of the flyby into the clinical precision of coming home. Splashdown remains scheduled for Friday, April 10th, at approximately 8:07 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, off the coast of San Diego. That detail matters because it reminds the viewer of something easy to forget in a story like this. Even after the most beautiful part of deep space, gravity still demands a return, and survival is only complete when the ocean finally receives the capsule intact. That is the final truth inside these 40 minutes. The blackout behind the moon was never an accident. It was a preview, a demonstration of what the universe is really asking from any civilization that wants to leave Earth for good. Not courage in the abstract, not inspiring slogans, but the willingness to enter a place where help disappears, on schedule, where silence is normal, where the landscape is magnificent and hostile at the same time, and where the line between history and helplessness can be nothing more than a horizon of rock. Artemis II survived that horizon, and that is why its most frightening moment may also be its most important one. Because the farther humanity goes, the less the universe feels like a destination, and the more it feels like a test.